Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for joining today's Cloud Transformation, Realizing the Value and Managing the Risk panel discussion. Panelists. Jamie, over to you.
Thank you, Desi. I really appreciate that. And thank you, Craig. The event so far has been wonderful. Learning so much, and I think we've got some really great participants. I've been looking forward to this, not just because this panel, I helped to put together, and I'm really keen to hear what they have to say. Some on this panel I've worked with, and some I got to just know more recently. As an economist, of course, part of what I do is all about exploring the value of certain things. And in recent years, of course, we've got what we refer to anyway is the emergence of modern capabilities, things that weren't necessarily capabilities even as recently as a decade ago. And some of these capabilities, and cloud is probably one of the chief among them, cloud-based services, and the whole concept behind that, that is, I guess, colloquially referred to as cloud, is a really interesting case. And our panelists today represent three of the biggest players in the world as it pertains to cloud services, both in terms of providing public cloud, but as well as what we'll probably refer to as hybrid cloud or hyper cloud, or we're going to hear all sorts of different kind of takes on the cloud notion. And I'm really looking forward to that. So without getting into it, instead of me going on about this and the kind of the fun parts of the economics behind this, I'm actually just going to open this up. The value statement or the case for cloud seems to be nearly a universal value proposition. And in fact, a lot of the cloud operators they're innovating and maturing cloud offerings at such a rapid pace. It's really interesting to watch. But as we do that, panelists, I'm actually gonna go to Charlotta first. But how do we express this? How do we express the value of cloud? Maybe in business terms. I mean, there's obviously a technical orientation to it, but how do you express value?
Thanks, James, and it's a pleasure to be here, and Mike and Alex sharing the panel with you. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to open. The value for me and where I see the simplest statement is what is fit for purpose. So different workloads have different characteristics. And the second statement that I always ask my customers or ascertain through analysis is, where's the data? Follow the data. So in that context, customers that I typically deal with have legacy workloads. They've got them in their old bricks and mortar data centers, and they're trying to respond to an ask from their business to put data at the edge out in the cloud or somewhere that it can be useful in some sort of digital incarnation. And so our challenge is in setting up how we create these multi-clouds or these hybrid clouds that gets the data to where it needs to be. And so from that perspective, that's the value. Because my background is very much on the infrastructure services side, I'm the ops part of DevOps. And so I take into consideration, that old slang expression, feeds and speeds, and making sure that the network is sound, that it's secure, and that as we're moving the data around, it's encrypted, it's secure, and it's safe in transit and at rest. So to summarize, really the value comes from understanding what you want your workloads to do or where you want your data to be active, and work back from that in terms of what is the best service that's going to meet that.
Yeah, and just coming in against that, Charlotte, I think that's a great perspective to have. And kind of curious, Mike, I know that you and I actually used to do some work together. And oftentimes, I mean, the buyer behind this type of capability would be ultimately finance, or at least the decision to invest in this area often needs to pass the finance test. Are there interesting ways that you've had to explain or articulate the value of this type of capability to someone with a financial hat on, maybe a CFO?
Yeah, I mean, it's gotten a lot easier over the last few years. I think as cloud first came to market, and I'll talk about cloud in general terms. Obviously at HPE, we refer to cloud as being an experience as opposed to a destination. Because it really is about those concepts of only paying for what you use, having elasticity, having flexibility, having portability and agility for the organization. All of that creates the business value for the organization. And I think with that in mind, the definition of value varies from one organization to another as they try and work through, what's important to them. We see people who get a mandate from finance that, hey, we have to cut costs. And so the first thing they'll do is say, oh, well, then we should move everything to the cloud, without actually figuring out what the financial benefit, operational benefit is of doing that. And so that becomes very, very critical for the organization. When we think about that concept of value, so again, historically we had those CapEx, OpEx conversations, trying to navigate that world as we got CFOs out of this mindset that it all had to sit on the balance sheet, and that there was actually a financial advantage to moving to an OpEx scenario. That's changed now. I think most people buy into it. And in fact, some of the frustration for some of our CIO counterparts is they spent 3 years convincing their CFO that they should move to OpEx for all of IT. But then they go for a CapEx budget for some workload that needs to operate on premise. And there's this schism that exists where, well, hang on a second, you told me OpEx was the way I should go. Now you're asking for CapEx budget. And so we try to address that by bringing that same consumption-based value proposition back on premise, so that now you can have a true cloud experience, that idea of only paying for what you use, elasticity, metered consumption, whether you're in a hyperscale cloud or whether you're in an on-premise or a private cloud. And I think that's where the value really comes from. We've seen customers where they'll do a lift and shift, and they don't see any value coming out of it because they're not taking advantage of what the cloud offers. That ability to run 24 cores of compute from 8 in the morning till 6 at night, and 2 cores of compute in the evenings on weekends, because the app is only used by the sales department, as an example. And that alone creates a 50–60% savings in cost.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation with finance in particular, because of course their perception might be different as a technologist. Your perspective might be on all the the assets that are now virtualized. They're not physical assets on prem, and that notion it's a very conceptual, kind of hazy notion to maybe finance or the business user. I mean, in terms of that, in Microsoft, for instance, Alec, I mean, you're one of the biggest public cloud operators there is, growing at an astonishing rate. I mean, do you come across these types of conversations with other non-IT or non-technical executive leaders?
Yeah, all the time. And I mean, it's been one of the most kind of interesting changes with respect to the impact of cloud, and why, Jane, when we were putting this together, I was so keen to talk to an audience of management consultants with such esteemed colleagues. It's every business, and I mean, not to kind of go with one of our taglines, but every business is a digital business now. And so IT doesn't just live in IT. I mean, there's concepts like shadow IT. I mean, technology and the impact of technology exists across the business. And so when we think about this in the context of cloud, 3 things. As Mike said, it's a method, not a destination, right? It's an experience, not a destination. There's this idea of the iron triangle of quality, velocity, and cost. Pick 2. If you can't do all 3, pick 2. Constantly be recalibrating. And then last but not least, it's the beginning of a business transformation journey. As Charlotta said, and as Mike said, if you just do it for the sake of doing it and ripping cost out of the business, don't be surprised if your competitors come racing up beside you and overtake you. There are a lot of businesses right now that are in existential crises. If you're a retailer, you're getting Amazoned. If you're a bank, you're getting fintech. If you're a media company, you're getting Netflixed. And so this isn't just about technology and a cheaper way to deliver technology and a more flexible way to deliver technology. There are fundamental business conversations that need to be had across all parts of the business and with all of the business leaders at the table. And you know, what we find a lot is two things. You know, to quote Yogi Berra, you know, if you don't know where you're going, you're going to end up somewhere else. And a lot of clients embark on this journey without a well-defined definition of where they want to get to and why, and they end up somewhere else. I mean, you may think that by moving to the cloud, you're going to make things radically simpler, you're going to have a better experience, you're going to have kind of metered pricing. But if you don't address all of the technology that you currently have and what you're going to do with that, you could in fact just increase the total amount of technology sprawl you've got. And then the second thing is just, you know, as Nora Young said today, any technology change or technical change is fundamentally a culture change. And cloud and what it has done for business and what digital business has done for companies and governments has fundamentally changed the role of senior leadership and how they participate in and strategize around and operate in a digital world.
I think that's excellent. And you mentioned that every business is a digital business. I really like that. And Charlotta, you mentioned that, you know, follow the data. I'm wondering in today's day and age, the last 10 or 15 years, I've noticed it in particular, you've got journals like, you know, the Harvard Business Review that it seems like every executive has a subscription to. Increasingly, we're actually able to have these conversations now with business leaders, aren't we? I mean, they are maturing in their understanding of what used to be kind of the domain of IT exclusively. Charlotta, could you comment maybe on some of the conversations that you have?
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for that, because there's two thoughts where the thread of our conversation is taking is that business needs to understand a little bit more about IT to really harvest it and use it. And IT also needs to appreciate a little bit more business language.
Yeah.
And I'm finding that, you know, exactly where we were going with in terms of who's going to be the new best friend of the CFO. Is it the director of IT operations who has a single dashboard and a console that is able to integrate and show all that consumption? And that's one of the things that I've been personally investing in and working on is that multi-cloud management platform. How can I represent the landscape of my customer from their legacy on-prem, old bricks and mortar to exactly consuming as a service out on the cloud? Two very different speeds. But how do we represent that? And I was working with a VP of operations who is very aggressive, and as part of the automation that we built into the platform, send out an email to anybody who spun up a server that's being utilized at less than 10% and give them 1 day. And if they don't respond after 1 day, then kill it, meaning shut the server down. And of course, this was in test dev, not production. But the notion is that this is where you actually get into that cost management. So as part of that culture and digital transformation, you have to be so sensitive to the cost management. What are those foundational tools that you need as part of the business of IT to monitor, manage, and I think, Mike, you use the term meter, because that's also where that economic value comes from.
Well, and I think that the other aspect of that is, so that, you know, that's very much on the cost side of things. The other thing that you want IT doing is, once they've got a platform that can meter things, that can spark things up very quickly, that can actually monitor in real time, to now become the innovation enablement platform for the corporation. You want to try something this weekend? Great. I got enough compute and storage for you to spin that up. You want to kick off a new business unit and you want to set them up somewhere and you don't want to have to worry about infrastructure? No problem. I'm your person to support that. You know, we had a customer who literally in the oil and gas sector lost out on a new property in the North Sea because their competitor was able to spin up more compute for their geologists faster than they were, so that they could get their bid in on what they thought that piece of real estate was worth, based on their ability to analyze the reservoir data faster than their competitor. That's the kind of innovation that cloud and on-demand and elasticity can bring. And so when the IT organization now becomes a business enabler, not just an area where we can save cost, but an area where we can actually champion new business ventures, and we can be more aggressive and more agile in the marketplace, that's real business value. That's when you get the attention of the CEO and the board. You're not just shaving a few percentage points off OPEX, you're actually contributing to the top line of the organization.
Spot on, and it is who owns the service catalog to the business, and how do I represent a relevant service catalog, again, that has all of the different as a service or platform or infrastructure, because that to me is, and I hope we have a discussion around culture, because to me that whole culture and governance of what services need to be as part of that package and shepherding that is critical.
And the definition of services too, right? Let's not just bring a whole bunch of highly technical things to the table. Again, thinking about how we
analytics,
can be accretive,
absolutely,
to the business as opposed to cost saving.
Yeah, I mean, James, not to take over your moderator role, but this is, and to pick up on what Charlotta said with the culture, this is exactly where this goes, right? Is the central IT organization is having a fundamental rethink. What is that catalog of services you're going to provide? How do you offer those things, right? So there's a lot of catchphrases out there. Infrastructure as code, DevOps, continuous development, continuous delivery. These are fundamental changes in terms of how these operations operate and the services they provide. And then on top of that, what else is in that service catalog? I mean, beyond kind of infrastructure, platform, securing it, ensuring everything's in compliance, right? What else is in that catalog? What solutions are in that catalog? As Charlotta said, as we push more data to the edge and we create these intelligent edge devices on the edge of the network, and we take advantage of things like 5G, is there a line of business expectation that the IT organization includes those kinds of leading edge solutions in the catalog as well? So it's a really interesting time to be a central IT organization and figuring out where you're going to go and how you define the value you provide for the organization.
Well, so Alec, just recognizing our audience breakdown a little bit, when we say pushing it to the edge, recognizing some of our folks might not be technologists, what do you mean by that? And I suspect you guys would all agree on what the edge means.
Yeah, I mean, Nora had a great example of it in her keynote at lunch, right? Like if you think about health and fitness, we all have these wearables. And so virtually everything out there is collecting data and transmitting that data back. And so, like if you're an HVAC manufacturer, you can put a sensor on things that spin, and you can collect data from those, spinning things and figure out how to do better preventative maintenance. And so there's tons and tons of examples. And so that intelligent edge is this idea that more and more of these devices that are, out in the wild, so to speak, are collecting information, transmitting that information, and allowing you to make decisions based on it.
Well, and I think as Charlotta said earlier, the edge clouds, as we sometimes call them, are becoming more sophisticated. They're not just data collection points. We're actually doing full storage and compute at the edge, whether it's on a factory floor, in a mine site, in a vehicle rolling down the road, or it could even be in aspects of a pre-existing facility. But it doesn't make sense for all data that's being collected and this growing portfolio of data to be uploaded into some central repository. The model that makes far more sense is you build these analytic models and then you deploy the models to where the data is and make a decision as close to the data as possible. And the result is, this kind of goes back to the culture conversation, we start making decisions as close to the people who actually need it. And I think that's another key part of that culture conversation is there's the culture of IT operations, but I would go one step further. And I don't think IT has an existential crisis. I think they have a charter crisis, which is what is the role of IT going forward? We're not going to eliminate IT, but is IT's job to maintain infrastructure? And I think cloud and cloud experiences have started to show that that's not really a valuable use for those resources. The one thing most IT departments have that's of true value is intimate knowledge of the organization they work in. relationships with the people who use the technology. If I can redeploy my IT organization to be closer to the people who use the technology, closer to the people who use the data, allow them to get value from it faster, allow them to adopt the technology quicker, so the organization is more operationally agile, that's the real value that IT can bring to the table. And we need to empower IT to be able to do that.
Isn't it interesting? You're basically arguing for an edge strategy, not with the technology, not with the storage of data and compute, but you're talking about people, literally.
Oh, totally.
So the role of the infrastructure engineer may change, but the role of, I mean, the emerging term, I guess, over the last 7 or 8 years is a business relationship manager, and people that are closer to the business, to where you could call it line proximity or
and they still might be technical. Right? Because they have to understand the underlying technology. I mean, I think most of us have been in a world where we get a new piece of software and we're incredibly non-productive. We may do training courses and we may do change management, but most of the organization is incredibly non-productive with that technology. If a highly technical person could, instead of spending time managing the platform, spend time supporting the people who use it, the organization moves forward far faster.
Well, agreed. And I think IT and that, again, the enterprise customers, and it depends on, are you a greenfields, a born on the cloud type of business, or do you have a lot of legacy baggage? Because I'm finding that we're having to manage two different skill sets. Your typical domain expert in storage, in server, in network, for the legacy workloads, but then the notion of a site reliability engineer is really catching, and it sounds like a very sort of nerdy plastic pocket protector ops kind of role, but I'm finding that an SRE or a site reliability engineer exactly has to have business relationships management. They need to understand the outcome that the customer wants at that edge, at that destination. I think, maybe put another way, we need to be much more flexible in terms of discussing outcomes, trusting that whatever service we're consuming will deliver that outcome, as opposed to getting into the how. And maybe that's a better way to express it. There are people that have to stay how people, because they need to understand how things work together. But then we need people that can integrate services that are what people, what is the outcome?
That's interesting. I'm going to go back to the HBR concept, because again, we have more and more non-IT executives learning. They're developing their understanding of what these modern capabilities can do. And a lot of it is, the glossy ads, frankly, your three companies are probably as much to blame as anyone. But I'm wondering about the expectation management. When a CEO reads a really, glossy ad and the cloud is promising all of this, I mean, it's true in a lot of ways. I'm kind of curious. I mean, have you three had experiences, maybe even using, for example, some of the wild expectations, both positive and negative, but have you experienced it, and how do you manage it? Because if you're involved with the implementation and the transformation itself, gosh, managing expectations, and we'll get into change management and culture management in a second, but how do you deal with these wild valuation issues?
Well, I mean, it's interesting for me. I have a very interesting perspective now. Full disclosure, Alec and I worked together for a long time. I was at Microsoft for 13 years. And so I've seen it from both the hyperscale perspective, and then also now at HPE, see it from the private cloud perspective. And I think the number one lesson that's come out of this is this belief that we can completely move to the cloud, right? A lot of people, and especially business leaders, because they get sold on some article, will push the pendulum hard to one direction and say, we're out of the data center business, we're out of the infrastructure business, everything's going cloud. And I think, that there's some value to that, in that it forces the organization to think about, how do we transform? But inevitably what happens is you get down that road and you discover that, okay, the reality is not everything can move. And it's not just because of the basic stuff, right? You know, we've seen, especially here in Canada with early cloud. Now it's not so much because we have hyperscale data centers in country, but sovereignty and data protection and privacy and things were always probably the core issue. Then what emerged was really this issue of latency. Physics became a barrier. We saw organizations, and we saw it especially with large multi-geographic deployments of things like SAP, where I've got branch offices in 100 locations. And when I stitch together, Charlotta talked about this earlier, I'd stitch together the wide area network, the round trip latency for some of these transactions is unacceptable when I'm sitting way off in some other far reach of North America. And then cost became an issue because people weren't taking advantage of where hyperscale makes sense is it's a pure economics conversation where you can get hyperscale and that economy of scale, cloud becomes a no-brainer. But not everything is hyperscale. Not everything has an economy of scale. I mean, you look at some of our colleagues, and you know, Microsoft's made huge investments, but for some of their, for example, high performance computing workloads, it only exists in 2 or 3 of their 54 data center locations because you just can't afford to put that much specialized compute or that much specialized storage in every location. It's not commodity. When it's commodity, you get real value. When it's not, then the cost math starts to fall apart and it doesn't make sense. So now I've got cost issues, I've got latency issues, and then the new problem that we've seen with more and more customers is on the application side, whether it's the gravity of data, the fact that, and we talked about this earlier, you can't move all data to the hyperscale cloud. I mean, you know, I'll be a little bit provocative at this point and just say, you know, one of the biggest challenges is it's very inexpensive to get data into hyperscale cloud. It is not inexpensive to get it out. And that's just the nature of how it's structured. And that's not a criticism of the providers. It's just the way they've chosen to build those services. So first of all, you got to worry about the long-term economics of having everything in the cloud. The second one is, do you really need it all there? And do you in fact need to store everything? And so going through a data governance model, so that data gravity becomes a core issue that you have to build an expectation around. And then the final one, and I spent a big chunk of my career doing this, is around application integration. Applications are portfolios. They are not standalone entities within our organizations. They're tightly integrated into, if it's retail, it's the point of sale system. If it's manufacturing, it's the quality assurance system or the CAD system or the CAM system. All of these systems are highly integrated. And when you start to, you know, they've done the easy lift and shift standalone applications. Now I got to worry about these other applications, and the integrations are just not tolerant to being highly distributed. They like to be in a single data center on gigabit Ethernet connectivity. And without that, you start to have real challenges. And so we don't want to abandon hyperscale cloud, but we want to put the right workloads there, take advantage of it, both for compute and storage, and then look for ways to build that right hybrid infrastructure.
Yeah, Alec, what do you think? I mean, the organization that you manage is tasked with successful transformation. In Charlotta, you would be as well. You know, what I'm kind of curious if there's been any kind of wild expectations that you've had to kind of come in and kind of reset a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And you know, I think the first thing that came to mind was the whole idea of consumerization of technology, you know, and we're on a Zoom call. So, you know, I'm a medical practitioner in a hospital environment. Why is it so hard for us to get on Microsoft Teams? Why can't I just talk to patients over Zoom? Right? And there's an expectation because of our consumer experience that things are easy. I click a button and off I go. And the reality is, you know, every organization, especially large, complex ones, regulated ones, need to pay attention to, you know, everything from, you know, the math, the economics, the, you know, the financial implications of these decisions, to also ensuring that they're well, you know, kind of designed from a security perspective, a compliance perspective. You know, I have worked with multi-billion-dollar organizations that have been taken down by $50, you know, exploits you can buy on the dark web, because they didn't worry about identity and how people authenticated against mission-critical company resources. I mean, that stuff matters, and it requires a thoughtful conversation. And you know, as Mike just kind of described in very quick order, there's a lot of stuff that you've got to think about, and you got to think about it. Because at the end of the day, you know, this is kind of the corporate, your executive fiduciary responsibility. I think the other things that people underestimate, and this kind of comes back to what Charlotta raised earlier, is two things: skilling and culture. There's a skills gap in Canada, for sure. And, you know, especially in areas like security, where, you know, the threat landscape is incredibly vast, and the number of certified skilled professionals to manage security is much smaller. You know, we as a company have made a lot of investments in skilling. We think a lot of people are going to get reskilled coming out of the pandemic, but we have a skills gap in Canada, and we run into this all the time with our customers, that we find that in Canada versus some of the other markets we operate in, you know, our customers are asking for much more prescriptive approaches from us, a lot more interest in managed services, a lot more interest in people, you know, like us, or, you know, IBM or HPE operating these things for them than we may see in other markets, right? And so skills is a big part of this too. And then culture, I mean, it's a much different kind of ball game. You know, I remember having a conversation with a senior executive at an insurance company, and they were making a decision about replacing their mission critical insurance platforms and systems with either a COTS solution, a commercially off the shelf solution, like Duck Creek or something like that, or building their own microservices architecture. And so it was one of those jump the shark moments for me, right? Like, I'm sitting down with a line of business C-level exec, and they're like, yeah, we're thinking about whether we go COTS or with a microservices architecture. And I was like, whoa. And to your point, this is one of those moments where I'm like, this is a really important conversation. So let's not just be chucking around words, because if you go with a microservices architecture, which essentially means that you are super agile in your ability to kind of build new products, new solutions, tweak things, you're talking about dev cycles of 2 weeks. You're talking about sprints. You're talking about creating backlogs. You're introducing new code and testing stuff, you know, moving stuff into production every couple of weeks. You're an insurance company who's operating on 20-year-old homegrown stuff. Is that really you, right? And there's significant cultural change that we've got to take into account.
Charlotta, I got a question for you, because I mean, there's the flip side to this. There's the, you know, these types of modern capabilities are an existential threat to my business. And I was just gonna, you know, the other day, my wife and I, we haven't yet, but I know everyone's watching The Social Dilemma, right? And so there's this concept of, my goodness, I had no idea. So Milos asks a question here online. He's like, what about data sovereignty? Gosh, what is the founded and unfounded threat behind data sovereignty, and how do you address that concern? Because that's the swing to the value proposition, which is, we can't go there. There's no value, or it's all threat, it's all risk.
Well, and it's a great question. And basically, from a data sovereignty or regulation, it also goes to, where is my data, but who from where is also monitoring and managing my services, my data, and who gets to actually inspect or see the data versus it's just whipping through some network encrypted. And really understanding also security technology, bring your own key, meaning you get to encrypt and you control it, not even the cloud provider can, quote, sniff in. There are all these different mechanisms, and quite honestly, I find that there's a bit of an education or an information lag in terms of how robust and how secure these conventions are, versus this image of a, you know, literally a network wire crossing a border, and then the moment it is in that border, then I don't have control of it anymore. But you also have to be extremely sensitive that certain countries have legislation that permit them to come in and inspect if it crosses their border, even if it has nothing to do with them. So you also need to be extremely sensitive in terms of where you're operating. Most cloud providers, all cloud providers, are going to be able to provide and do provide on-prem Canadian sovereignty. one of the big things that we're investing in is providing the management and the tooling to do that within our borders as well, so that from a global delivery perspective, we're very, very clear. I think I also want to comment too on, expectations and reality. Exactly all of the comments that Alec and Mike brought up in terms of hyperscale, in terms of going to a services architecture versus sticking to legacy, is the notion that clouds are self-managed. And that if I go to a cloud, then all that other stuff that I used to have to take care of, they will take care of. And that is by and large true if you stay homogeneous in one cloud provider, because they're designed to do that. But I have not yet met a customer that is in one hyperscale cloud. And so as you're thinking through your data architecture, your data sovereignty, understand which cloud providers you're working with. And one of the things that we at IBM really reinforce with our customers is the concept of open. How do you create that platform, that glue that allows all those services from your ecosystem to work together?
That's interesting. And we've got questions coming in that kind of the focus on that, and we've kind of danced around the change management side and the culture change, that sort of thing. But I wanted to touch on this one question from Jeremy. He says most legacy organizations, when adopting cloud, tend to move to a hybrid model. Do you think that's just a sweet spot, or does the opportunity really exist to move entirely to a cloud-based model?
It's a transfer. It's a time. I'm going Star Trek on you. Time space continuum, because organizations need to learn they need to learn cloud, and they need to understand what is, back to my first comment, fit for purpose. So hybrid conveniently says, we're not going to ignore the investments that you just made over the last 20, 30, 40 years in IT as you transform to your new digital experience. And it basically just gives the customer time. It's like a teeter-totter. You're going to start very, very big on old legacy, and then mainframe is a perfect example of that. There are so many customers that their crown jewel data and services are on mainframe. And I get into lots of conversations around, I want to get off my mainframe. And I always tell my customers, the mainframe is dead, long live the mainframe. Because there are just certain workloads and characteristics in the way they've set things up. It would be a fundamental shift in their business processes to allow them to go to cloud.
And it goes back to the opening conversation we had around value, right? Mm-hmm. If you amortize the cost of that transformation over even 25 years, do you get a return? And in many cases you don't, because it is so highly integrated, so highly ingrained. In the worst case is a lot of those mainframe applications, the guys who wrote the original code have retired or maybe even passed on. And so you're dealing with black box software that it contains IP. It's not just generic software. It contains the IP of the organization. And so that becomes a critical thing. I think that back to Jeremy's question about hybrid, I think Charlotta makes a very good point. Hybrid represents a great way for organizations to ease their way into cloud, because you move those things that make sense and you keep those other things on premise. As we go into what I would call, we'll probably have to call it Cloud 3.0, because I think we've already gone through Cloud 2.0, but as we go through 3.0, which is really this next generation of microservices, this next generation of not really cloud native, we'll call it container native. Containerization is really going to fundamentally change the way people adopt technology in general. Because now I take that concept of microservices and I can actually break my application up into these highly mobile pieces of intellectual property. And I can make a decision to run it on Azure today, run it on AWS tomorrow, run it on premise next week. Or I can say, well, that piece of my application is highly latency dependent. I'm going to run that in a hybrid mode because I can never move it to the cloud. But the other parts of my application that make total sense, I'm absolutely going to move those to cloud. And we're seeing really interesting trending in SaaS. Software as a service, remembering our audience may not understand the acronyms, these software as a service scenarios where many of them picked a particular hyperscale cloud, built their next generation application on that, and they offer it, but as a complete software as a service offering. We're seeing many ISVs go to the next version of their software as being a container version, so that they're no longer tied to any one cloud platform. They have the flexibility because they've encountered customers who've said, for data sovereignty reasons, as was asked, but also just for physics reasons, the way their staff work, the way their data center works, that application or a component application has to run on premise. And by moving to that model, you have this great flexibility. And I think that really is going to be the next wave of hybridization, is this concept of where containers fit within the application infrastructure story for you and your cloud experience.
Alec, I got to ask you. I mean, you represent Microsoft, who's a public cloud provider. I mean, if you look at the classification, Gartner or whatever, I mean, you're one of the big. You've got massive market share in that sector. Is this a threat to Microsoft? Or in my experience working with Microsoft, this is actually an opportunity, because you guys, as far as public cloud providers, this is something that you foresaw ages ago, and you've kind of jumped that trend early. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I'll classic PR move. I'll kind of answer your question, but then say something else too, which is no, like, I mean, it's not a threat. It's a really interesting thing though for so many traditional or bricks and mortar businesses. So it's not a threat to us because, as our CEO likes to say, our industry has no respect for tradition. Our industry only respects innovation. And so this idea that the world is constantly changing, this is what we kind of live for and get up for, and constantly have to innovate. Because as Mike said, containerization, yeah, absolutely. On the face of it, it could be a threat, because back to the conversation of, the person who runs IT ops being the best friend of the CFO, the CFO could come see them every day and go, where'd you move everything to optimize cost for us, and how much money are you making for us today, right? And so I'm on Azure today, I'm on AWS tomorrow, I'm on GCP or Google Cloud Platform on Thursday. So yeah, I mean, that stuff's just really interesting in terms of how this evolves. But if you look at what that means for every business that is now becoming a digital business, and back to the skilling and the culture and the agility by which they've got to operate, this is a fundamental rethink for those organizations, where, I mean, and not too long ago, we had periodic procurement cycles, we had periodic deployments of technology, and you put it in place, you lived with it for whatever, 8 or 10 years if it was infrastructure, 3 or 4 or 5 if it was, on the workplace productivity side. That stuff's fundamentally being rethought. There's no time to rest, and it's just constantly in motion and being innovated and iterated. And I think that's why skilling and culture is so fundamentally important in this. At the same time, keeping up on the stuff that could totally sink you if you don't pay attention to it, the security, the compliance, the ethics around AI, right? And so it's just such a fascinating time.
The other thing that's important is, and we saw this when I was at Microsoft, we see that today, and I'm sure all of you see this, the concept of skilling and culture isn't just about filling gaps. It's also about making sure that people feel empowered to participate in the transformation. One of the #1 barriers to cloud transformation is people who openly fight it. And the reason they fight it is they don't see a future for themselves in that transformed world. Skilling and developing modern contemporary skills and showing people how they can use cloud transformation to give them new skills is the fastest way to accelerate your cloud journey, because now everyone participates. I would say when I would sit, and today when I sit with a CIO or a business leader, and they'll inevitably say, look, we're not moving as fast as we want to, my own staff are openly fighting me. There's always an excuse for why we can't do something. And when you dig under the covers, you realize it's people who are scared about their jobs. They've been the guru in a certain piece of technology or a certain area of the IT organization for 20 years. And now we're going to move all of that somewhere where they don't get to keep that guru status. Well, but we can give them skills that allow them to be a guru in a new way. And I think that's the real critical part of that skilling and culture conversation as well.
Mike, let me ask you a question. This actually comes from Bill on the boards right now. So Bill served on several boards of directors, and is within the healthcare community. And this is really resonating with him in terms of that skill gap. What are your thoughts and comments on ways to address that gap in partnership with the executive leadership, the president, the CEO, from the board perspective, and maybe comment on to what degree really should we have representation on the board level for these types of notions around maybe modern capabilities in general? Certainly cyber could be part of it.
This goes back to that age-old statement that people say, but I think they sometimes don't take to heart, right? Our most valuable off-balance sheet asset is our people. And we will spend tons of money on maintenance of capital equipment. We'll spend tons of money on making sure that our offices are great for people to come to. We don't spend enough on making sure our people are the best. And my favorite conversation was someone said, well, if we do that, that just makes them prime candidates to get picked off by our competitors. And I said, well, I'd rather have really smart people that may occasionally leave than have really dumb people that nobody wants.
Right.
And so, we do have to think about how we invest in those skills. And I think it is a board level conversation. Just as you have a compensation committee, just as you have a capital allocations committee, you need to have a skills and training and capabilities committee that's part of HR. And that's a critical part of how you build that asset, that off balance sheet asset, and make sure it's valuable to the organization.
Well, that's right. And continuous learning is essential. And that is absolutely a board decision because it's investment in education, certification. All of us have these huge certification programs that and you can be as comprehensive and deep as you want, or scratch the surface type. But I think that also the boards, C-suite, need to make those decisions that signal very clearly, this is where we're going, or this is the new technology that I'm going to embrace. And that skilling conversation can actually be, the classic lead, follow, or get out of the way, because these are the types of things, and being very transparent to say, and this is what we're doing as part of reskilling and conversations that I'm having deep with system administrators that are used to giving console commands to old structure IT. And, I'd be listening for, well, I just wrote a quick script to automate this little process that was happening between the network and the server. And people that have that acumen, well, they're the ones that you want to invest in, because they're going to understand containers, they're going to understand services integration, they're going to understand those concepts, but they just don't know anything about business. And so from my perspective, all those people are out there that we need to harvest, but we just haven't got that sensitive ear to listen for them to say, I can empower you.
That's a great skills conversation too, Charlotte. Thank you for raising that. Like, it's not about technical skills. It is also about soft skills. It's also about business skills. Those are as important as the technical skills.
Yeah, I mean, we've been on a cultural transformation, as people may or may not know, and there's a few aspects of it that I think are important to us and kind of interesting for our customers. Number one is a shift from a know-it-all to a learn-it-all culture. We used to run the business based on scorecards and green, yellow, red, and all the rest of it, and it was about showing up and knowing your business to 2 decimal points. Now it's about being a learn-it-all and driving insights. So the conversations we have about the business through our regular rhythms of connection are fundamentally different. They're about, what did you learn? What are we doing about it? How are we continuing to change and evolve? The second one is around our frontline managers and creating a culture of coaching. Most of us who are managers were promoted into management positions because we mastered our craft and we became advice giving monsters. And so people come to us and they're like, I've seen that one before. Here's what you do. But, it's about coaching. It's about, pausing, not giving that advice, and letting people find the solutions. And those are things that as a board member, you can ask, the executive team about, like, how are we running the business? How are we inspiring people to provide us with insights? How are we taking advantage of insights to try things, to incubate ideas? What's our culture around coaching our people, around people development? And then last but not least, diversity and inclusion. We as a tech industry have not done nearly enough. We as a company have not done nearly enough, but we are focused on it. And it is just so incredibly important in terms of what comes next. The software and the data that we have will fundamentally give us the opportunity to rethink everything from prisons to traffic to the healthcare system. But if we don't have diverse and inclusive workforces, God help us if we leave it up to, anything less than a complete mosaic of Canada, right? Sorry, go ahead, Charlotta.
Well, I apologize. I cut you off because I'm so excited to just say, to our audience as management consultants, ask the provocative questions, get the feedback. And IBM, transparently, was a very command and control in the technical services part, because we're so focused on operations and always on that the margins for mistakes, especially in production, when you've got planes in the air that need to land, when you've got nuclear reactors running, when you basically have the financial markets relying on that, then yes, we're always on, and we have that performance culture. So instilling that, well, you want me to take a risk? Well, define the risk. And that's all about exactly giving that freedom to give them platforms or places to go do that. And not, of course, in a production environment, but that's where that experimentation and field, feedback comes from. So I think that also to complement the diversity is like just listening to a different perspective, whether it's a cultural diversity or whether it's gender. It's just having that different perspective and opening up. And I think exactly from a consulting perspective, that's what I'm seeing as part of a renaissance in the real technical services part of the business, is that you've got to be a better listener and you have to interpret.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to where we were at the beginning of the conversation, which is you have to have mechanisms, and this is the transformation for IT, and to be honest, the transformation for business. There has to be mechanisms to make it easy for people to not only use the technology, but use the technology in a way that is accretive to the organization. And that is skills, it's diversity, it's capability, it's understanding those skills aren't just technical skills, they're business skills, there are other soft skills associated with that. All of that relates to that concept of how do we make it easy for people to embrace the transformation and take advantage of it. And that's easily, and especially for this audience, probably one of the most critical change management issues that we need to solve today is exactly that.
Interesting because CMC is really taking a leadership role in diversity and inclusion. In fact, we've been exploring the notion of inclusivity by policy. That's our mandate, is to be inclusive. And then at the same time, exploring the means to articulate the value of diversity. So you're inclusive by design, and you're recognizing the value of diversity. I think this actually, the nice thing or the interesting thing about diversity and inclusion is it scales up and down, it cascades through the organization from kind of an organizational strategic value of diversity all the way down to implementation teams, operational teams, and you name it.
But it's also extra organizational, right? So that's an intra-organizational concept, but it also affects the relationship with your customers, your partners, your supply chains, everything.
You have to define how people want to interface or integrate with you, your value to them, and vice versa. You have to be able to be open enough to accept, because the modern conventions is and I like that expression, going from know-it-all to know as much as you can and integrate. And I think that whole philosophy is, I don't necessarily need to know everything, but I need to know where I can go extract it for value.
And I need to be willing to do that, That's the
Correct.
inclusion part. Is
But that's
where
security.
the learn it all becomes so critical, because if I naturally know that I know where to go, and I naturally bring in a diverse set of opinions and perspectives, I'm naturally going to be inclusive. I don't need a policy for that.
Yeah, I had an opportunity to talk to some early career stage folks through the Empower organization, which seeks to connect recent grads and kids with opportunities in technology, especially racialized communities. And the piece of advice I gave them, as much as it's worth for a free piece of advice, was be curious, be connected, and try stuff.
Yeah, that's excellent.
Everything else will take care of itself.
Great guidance.
Yeah, aggressive listening. That's the number one rule.
Yeah.
Sounds dangerous.
Yeah.
Well, it's dangerously smart.
Well, they used to say active listening, but I think you're taking that one step further.
Well, to me, it goes back to, it's the curious conversation, right? I mean, Alex hit the nail on the head, right? You have to be, again, in that learn it all versus know it all. The know it all was you aggressively pitched people on your ideas. The learn it all is, okay, well, what about this? Well, tell me how this works for you. Well, where does this go next? And how would you deal with this? And constantly asking questions and trying to get as much information as possible. And that's what I call aggressive listening.
Well, Charlotta, I mean, going back to what you said about diversity and inclusion, this actually can happen down at the transformational level where you've got teams that are looking to transform the business. I mean, you and I had talked actually earlier this week about kind of the hairball that happens when you're doing something that's so intensely transformational. It's not a technical thing, it's an operational thing. Can you comment on the non-technical aspects, say the social, political aspects of that type of change, maybe?
Yes, and thank you for that, because and in my introduction, I do refer to the hairball of complexity, because the usual suspects that show up on your cloud journey is network, connectivity, security, and then also culture. And the culture is one of trust, because you're essentially creating trust networks when you consume cloud services. And so exactly in that understanding of the requirements, what do you want this to do? How are you going to manage it all? And that comes back to, I find that a lot of organizations in the C-suite want to extract that value of creating things on the cloud. They see a very successful digital transformation, and then there's a Scooby-Doo moment, ruh-roh, because I don't know what's going on my networks. I actually haven't thought about what my data backup strategy is or my disaster recovery. And it's back to that notion of those clouds just manage themselves, but no, there are some foundational, fundamental things. And so that's that hairball part, which is we can go get all the business value we want, but you will lose that return on investment unless you do a little bit of foundational homework in traditional IT operations design.
That's great. I've got it. Listen, we're kind of going into the Q&A time right now. So I'm going to throw a couple out. So it's going to be less consistent and follow some of the questions. But one of the questions is what about, and this is essentially a question that comes from Lauren, how many organizations are essentially laggards in this space? And because again, this isn't cloud as a destination, as experience, but how many are lagging, and is this an existential threat to them? And then piling onto that, a question from Pete, which is, hey, what about the COVID? Has COVID amplified the need, the value, or where are we at, and will we see that die off once there's a vaccine, for instance?
Well, I'll answer the second question from Pete first, because it kind of goes back to what Charlotta was talking about. Is what COVID has done is had an even bigger impact on corporate networks, because now people don't come into a building that's on Cat 6 gigabit plus Ethernet where you don't worry about latency, you don't worry about security, you don't worry about any of the the intermittent issues that exist when you start building complex wide area networks. COVID has created for many organizations the most complex wide area network topology they've ever seen in their lives, and they're having to navigate that as an organization. And so what it's done is it's actually pushed the hybrid conversation even more aggressively, because one of the things that emerges is there's some great virtual desktop technologies in hyperscale cloud, unless you need access to an on-premise application, and then the whole thing starts to fall apart, right? So these are things that organizations are having to deal with. And then the laggard conversation is an interesting one. I don't think there's an existential issue today, but I would say, and I think Alex's opening comment about, every business is a digital business. If you don't embrace that concept and figure out how you embrace some form of digital technology, and that doesn't mean that you run software to run your business, but that you've got some kind of broader digital connectivity, whether it's on the supply chain side, the employee side, the customer side, what have you. That is going to be a challenge for you, because as we talked earlier, it's all about building connections, building networks. The speed at which business flows is really dependent on your ability to have that connective tissue, that digitally connective tissue within your organization. And that is something you're going to have to embrace. You won't be able to stick your head in the sand and cloud's just a fad and it's going to go away. But you do need to figure out how to embrace that going forward.
Well, and the laggards, I think, are not sensitive to exactly the different performance characteristics. So, for instance, dealing with a manufacturer of dairy products, their communication with their supplier on a farm, remote, where the farmer is an expert in cows and dairy, but they need very specific data from him, probably running on an old telephone line. So how do you set it up for them to be successful to transfer to you the data sets that you need, versus exactly going into the production factory that is in city, has all of those speeds and performance characteristics? That to me is where you're going to see the laggards, is that they're not sensitive to the performance characteristics of where they need their data to be successful as a business.
Well, and I think that concept of solving problems with what I used to describe as $50,000 Band-Aids. I can always hire a clerk to go and do some data entry or to do something manual for me. And that concept has gone away. We don't have the population for it, let alone the cost profile in our businesses to justify it. We need to find ways to help automate that connection for the farmer.
Agreed.
That's great. And by the way, speaking of data, there was a question, strategic versus operational data. This comes from Nima. What are your thoughts on one taking precedence over the other, moving to the crowd from an ROI perspective? And I think that's, can you address that without knowing more?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we see a lot is if you need high performance data, and this goes back to my earlier comment about where hyperscale, because it is hyperscale, where you have highly commodity driven workloads, you can't touch the financial ROI of hyperscale cloud. But where you have more non-commodity specialized workloads, so high performance storage, high performance computing, things of that nature, it becomes an interesting challenge. And that's where hybrid becomes very interesting. And so building a data lifecycle strategy. We talked about edge clouds earlier. So what data do you process at the edge and then dispose of? Because you just need the answer. You don't need the data.
Right.
What data do you consolidate operationally? And that might be in a hybrid scenario. And then what data do you use for occasional reporting or archival? And that's where you've got a great potential hyperscale model. And then the ecosystem that exists between all of those clouds, the edge cloud, the private cloud, and the hyperscale cloud, and the data lifecycle between them.
And I'm very interested in operational data, because to me, that's my currency to get predictive and actually to prevent an outage and use AI. So when I see the performance characteristics of always on, and again, these are also design considerations for businesses. I use the term crown jewels those are the absolute must always be on, because they're going to get a design and a treatment that's different than run of the mill, let's say. And so for me, my operational data and the currency of, can I create a data lake that allows me to run some analytics on it and then do some predictive, so that there was never even an issue that there may have been an outage because I was able to cut it off and put in a backup or a supplementary service. So, but I smiled when the question was asked, because it is always the business data that is absolutely the biggest currency, and operational data that we need for always on is absolutely going to be an offshoot in that context. I mean, in terms of the importance to the business, it's important, yes, but it's always going to be the business data that gets the visibility.
Fantastic. In the last couple of minutes, any final thoughts on kind of managing the value or realizing the value of cloud, and by extension managing the risk associated? Alec, maybe I'll go to you first, but what's kind of the bottom line from an executive perspective?
Wow, thanks for going to me first. I spend a lot of time worrying about permanent partial attention, and how everything's moving very quickly. Everything's moving even faster because of COVID and the pandemic. I read an interesting article the other day about the impact of prolonged stress on your brain and on your mindset. And in periods of prolonged stress, your brain just becomes more and more attuned to threats and becomes more and more rigid in its ability to think widely and creatively. And so when organizations are making fundamental decisions about the future of the business, about how they become digital businesses, about what they prioritize and why, about how they ensure that they secure themselves, about their stewardship for culture, for skilling, and those kinds of things. How do you make sure that you're present, thoughtful, bring the right voices to the table, maybe not the voices that you traditionally have brought to the table, and the right advisors, right? And so a lot of it comes back to that idea of growth mindset and learning and being curious and connected and trying things, but also being conscious of the fact that you've got to spend the right amount of time. That doesn't mean go slow. It just means go thoughtfully. I see a lot of rescue missions, oftentimes, and Michael recalled this from his days at Microsoft. Often I show up at, heinous scenes and have to triage situations and get them back on track. And it's not pretty. And a lot of this can be avoided with kind of growth mindset, with thoughtfulness, with getting the right people engaged and thinking it through. So that would be my thoughts on it. Probably not what you thought from a guy from Microsoft, eh? Like, go Azure, right?
Yeah. Well, what I like about you, Alec, is you're a fellow economist, so I like to come back to that.
Really, I've become a behavioral economist, eh?
Exactly. Consumption economics, behavioral economics. Mike, how about you? And I'll finish off with Charlotta.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally, and this kind of goes back to one of the questions was about laggards. I think that's my biggest concern, is that there's a group of organizations out there that are kind of in the batten down the hatches mode. And then there's another group of organizations that are making very knee-jerk reactions, right? They say, okay, this will solve everything. It'll solve our cost problems. It'll solve our operational problems. Let's just move everything to the cloud. And in both of those scenarios, they're in for some really disappointing times ahead if they don't develop a more comprehensive strategy. Again, we had the diversity and inclusion conversation. I think there needs to be a diversity of approach, because we know there are technical and operational, and in some cases financial limitations to where you put workloads and how you provide the agility that the organization is looking for. And so I think Instead of what concerns me is the people who see that as being too complex to undertake, and therefore we can't do anything. I think you have to start, and once you start and you develop that agile culture, we talked about it earlier, you know, start to execute in incremental pieces and develop those skills and start to move forward one foot in front of the other, the classic kind of progress methodology. Then you start to eliminate the technical debt that exists within your organizations. And that is probably the biggest boat anchor that people have today. Once you develop a consumption-based strategy, once you move to a more modern application portfolio, and you start to shed some of that technical debt, you feel lighter, you feel more nimble, you can actually start to move forward more aggressively, but you got to start.
Thank you. Charlotta?
For me, it's making sure that you've got those foundational services in place that can help you manage your journey. And then exactly feeding off of both what Mike and Alex said, you don't have to boil the ocean, but find the business value, start somewhere and scale. Yeah. And that then allows you to get those trail markers in terms of, I can be successful doing this and this did work for me. But just the idea and the notion of saying I need to get to cloud, I also like to use a quote from Jack Kerouac, which is, you ain't lost if you don't care where you are. and so most boards and most C-suite don't necessarily operate that way, but it sure looks like that sometimes from here. Yeah. So get exactly that roadmap or that strategy to say, I have these workloads that are going to bring business value, and let's have that dialogue with my colleagues that want to learn it all as opposed to know it all in IT. And I think that that's also that catalyst kind of conversation. How do I bring together those like-minded people and avoid that lock-in?
Fantastic. Thank you, all three of you. It's been a very interesting conversation. We didn't get to all the questions. There's a lot coming in, but we really appreciate your time. And what struck me as really interesting is that you're three different companies, in some ways, three different competitors. But as we discussed earlier, you guys each have forged really important and material partnerships between each of you. And in the level of collaboration, I don't know if a lot of people appreciate or know about it, but it's really quite compelling. It was wonderful to hear you guys collaborating today. Craig?
Thank you very much, James. Excellent conversation, I must say, and so much to take in. Thank you, Charlotta. Thank you, Alec. Thank you, Mike, for all your insights.